Welcome to the Festival of Storytellers.
I can't tell you how excited I am to be on right now. It's been a couple of weeks of excitement, getting prepared, and I've done a lot of things in my life, but this has got to be close to the top.
Thank you, and Reader's Magnet, and thank you, John, for putting this forth and taking the chance on us authors in presenting this out to the world.
I've enjoyed this immensely, Joanne.
Ellie, so have I. Thank you for who you are, and thank you, Reader's Magnet. You all are beautiful, and you've worked so very hard, and we are blessed.
We are.
I thank everybody that's involved with this process, because we know writers need readers and writers need publishers. We thank Reader's Magnet and everybody that's involved. I love Reader's Magnet. They say, we share your stories with the world.
Good afternoon, and I am Margaret Krivchenia, and I am so happy to be able to talk to you today. Thank you so much, Reader's Magnet, for this Festival of Storytellers. I am so grateful to have this opportunity to see all of you and greet you and to talk about something that has become so near and dear to my heart, and that is writing books. And this is something, it's been an incredible journey. I just have to tell you a little bit about my background. I grew up in Michigan. I now live in the Tampa Bay area of Florida, and for 24 years I was a counselor. Never thought that I'd end up being an author. But the beauty of it all, and I thank God for this, it's such a gift and a blessing, is when I started having my grandchildren, and I have 4 of them. Um, my little grandson, when he was 2, Harrison, loved to sleep over. And I would tell him stories. We'd have bath time, and I would tell him stories. He'd say, Grandma, make up a story and tell me. So that's how actually I became an author, is I started out by telling my grandson stories at bedtime. I would use the little rubber ducky and the little toys from his bath, and I created a magical forest and talking animals. And I ended up creating a great big scrapbook where I printed out my story and illustrated it. And I did this for a couple of years until finally a friend of mine said, did you ever think of having your books published? And I said, no, it's never occurred to me. So at that time, I had started writing the Four Cousins Mystery Series, and the cousins are actually my four grandchildren. I have two girls and two boys, and I started writing stories involving them. And for Christmas and for their birthdays, I would give them these big scrapbooks. I'd print out my story, I'd illustrate it, and I'd give it to them as a present. And so when my friend said to me, "Did you ever think of sending it in?" I thought, oh my goodness, who would want to read that? And this can't, I would be shocked. But I went online, and of course, the first thing I always do is I take it to the Lord and pray about it. And when I brought it up, I saw Christian Faith Publishing in Meadville, Pennsylvania. So I sent my first story to them, which was called The Ghost of Canyon Camp. And I was very nervous about hearing back from them. And finally, what was really funny is I was at an event and I got this email, "Please call us." And I said to my husband, "Oh my gosh, I'm so afraid to do this. What if they don't like it?" And he said, you gotta go ahead and call them, Margaret. So I did the next day, and they said they love the books. And that started my career as an author. And I now have written four of the Four Cousins Mystery Series. And the new adult novel that I just finished is called Evermore, and it was just published and it came online in July. And this is near and dear to my heart. I will talk in the coming days more about the Four Cousins Mystery Series, which was kind of my launching pad as an author. But I want to talk today about Evermore. This is a lot of fact, some fiction, and it's about my family. And it's been on my heart for quite a long time to tell the story of my mom and dad, how they met, my grandparents. And this is a tribute to them. It's in honor of them. And so I wrote this story. I started writing it. And as I said, I've been thinking about this for several years, wanting to do it. I wrote this story, and it spans the decades from the 1930s all the way up to the new millennium. And it tells the story of my mom and dad, how they met, of my mom's lost love in the very beginning, and basically how my dad saved her. It starts out when my mom is 15 years old, and it goes through her entire life. It brings in my father, it brings in my grandparents, and all the things that they did and where we lived. It's really a treasure. So the book is not just historical romance, but it's also a mystery. And it's a mystery of this dark secret that my mother has that's finally revealed at the end of the book. And I look on this book as their journey, because they were faith-filled people. And it's their journey to salvation and redemption for all of them. In Evermore, and I titled it Evermore because of the faithfulness and the love that they all had for each other. The story does take place in upstate New York, which is where my parents grew up. They grew up in Auburn and Union Springs. Auburn is on Owasco Lake. And in the story, I changed the name to Shimmering Falls. And all the names in the stories have been changed, but the characters are real. The characters are my mom and dad, my grandparents, the brothers and sisters, it's the cousins, and it is all the events that took place all the way through the Depression, World War II, all up into the new millennium, all the children and grandchildren. And my husband and I had the fortune to go back to upstate New York. As I said, I now live in the Tampa Bay area. So we decided, and this was several years ago, that we were going to travel up to Auburn, New York, and I wanted to visit all the places where my mom and dad had grown up. I wanted to go to the Springside Inn where they had their wedding reception. I wanted to go to Owasco Lake and see the dance hall where they would meet and have their dances. I wanted to go to the church where they were married and also see the home where my mother grew up because she grew up in a funeral home. And at that time, back in the 30s and 40s, the funeral homes were kind of a family affair. And mom lived upstairs, and downstairs was the funeral home. She was an only child because her two brothers had, her one brother actually had died. He was born when she was 12, and her mom, the little boy, just died right after birth. So this impacted the entire family. So I tell the story of her growing up in Auburn, and I tell the story of this great love of her life when she was just 15 years old. And so when I wanted to look at this book of Evermore, and I thought, how am I going to start telling this? Because I don't want to just have it be, just one fact after another. So I saw it first of all as a romance. And I started out with it being this beautiful romance that started out when my mother was 15, when she was in love with this young man. Ian is in the book. Her name's Elizabeth. His name is Ian. My father is Joseph. He comes in a little later. But her first love was Ian. And so I start out with the romance. The mystery comes a little bit later into the story. This secret that really she harbors and holds in her heart all of her life, which impacts her entire family and impacts her daughter. In the story, I am Mariana. And most of the facts that you read in there about my young life growing up are factual. I did go into more fiction on how I ended up marrying my second husband and meeting him. But the romance starts out, and it's the first half of the book, is about my mother, Lisbeth, and Ian, and their journey in love to each other, and the tragic events that does take them away from each other. Joseph, who is my dad, came into the story, and he met my mother when she was 14, actually, because his cousin was my mom's best friend. In the book, she's called Lita. In real life, she was Alita, which is her mom's name in the story. So that's how my dad met my mom. He would spend every summer up in Auburn, New York, with his cousin, and he says to me, he told me many years ago, all the time growing up, I loved your mom from the time I met her she was 14 years old and I was 17. So since the first love of her life uh, was tragically not to be, my father was always there. And my mom and dad were married for over 65 years. And that was another beautiful romance. But the mystery came later in the story, and that has to do with what happened between Ian and my mother and what affected her long term for her entire life, because she never really got over this loss. And it really influenced how she treated her family, including her daughter, which was me, and how she reacted to just everyone. So, in the end of the story, there is a salvation and a redemption, a coming of peace to my mom and to my dad in the story, to the whole family. And I don't want to tell you the complete story, or nor do I want to go into detail on the mystery of what the dark secret might have been. So that is something that you can find out when you read the book. But it is just a beautiful, beautiful reflection and a recollection for me on the memories, because my grandparents lived with us. So grandma would tell me from the time I was little all about their family, all about her sisters and brothers, all about growing up in New York, all about living in the funeral home and my mom. So I got to know them very, very intimately. And I try and share this in this book of Evermore. I want the characters to come alive for you, so you'll see them as I do. They were very human. They had their loves, they had their tragedies, their sorrows, their joys, they had their angers and their reconciliation, just like we all do. So, and they had the story tells, of course, my father going off to World War II, where he was going to be, a tail gunner. And it was my mom who basically would save him from that. But she didn't see him for 3.5 years after they were married because he was in England. So it tells that story. It tells the story of him coming back and they have to get to know each other all over again. Every event that you see in here is factual, especially the first half of the book. The second half, as I said, when I meet my second husband, there's fiction in there of where I met him. But where we got engaged and the love that we shared is true in there. So when I see this, I redo a lot of research for my books. So obviously I wasn't living in the 1930s or the 1940s. So I had to ask my grandmother, and she filled in. But what I did is I went back. I have all kinds of pictures. I have a suitcase full of pictures from the time, from all of my family. I would look at those, and my mother would label the photos. I researched what was going on during the 1930s. Like I wanted to see what did the cars look like? What did the clothes look like they were wearing? Even how did they talk? Did they say swell? Did they say cool? How did they talk back then? So I researched that just so that I could make the novel as authentic as possible so that it would seem real. And I have to tell you, one of the things that was so heartwarming is when people read this and they'd be up all night reading it because they couldn't wait to finish it. They would say they were transported back to the 1930s, to the 40s, to an older time, and they could actually see the old car. Like, in here, I'll tell you a little thing. My mother learned to drive on a 7-passenger hearse. And so I described that in there. And they said, oh my gosh, we remember, seeing pictures of those cars. So, yes, I do quite a bit of research. And what I want, what I want people to come away from this book with is the resiliency of the human spirit and the hope that we all have, that God gives us, that He is always with us and He walks with us through our joys and through our sorrows, and He holds on to us. And one of my favorite poems was that Footsteps that many of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with. And it says, when I couldn't walk, you carried me. And so Jesus did carry them. God did carry them. And so I want the readers to understand that all of us come through great sufferings, great sorrows, but there is hope and there is love and there's light and there's mercy, and that we can come out on the other side, and that all of us have a family story to tell, and that in that family story, there is help and there is love. And we just have to hold on to that and hold on to that faith. Now, the other novels that I wrote, well, I started out doing the Four Cousins Mystery Series, and I'm going to talk in more detail in the coming days about them. They were the very first books I wrote, and they were for the 8 to 12-year-old group. And as I said, they have to do with my 4 grandchildren, and they are the main characters in this story: Harrison, Emma, Parker, and Kate as the oldest. She's the one in charge. And those are the real names of my grandchildren. I asked permission from my sons and their wives if I could use the name, and they said fine. So the stories, the one thing that they do have in common is that these are also stories of redemption and salvation. Because the 4 cousins, they always meet somebody and they end up turning their lives around and showing that God is always with these people who are really wandering. Um, Writing the children's books, I love that. And in fact, the 5th one, there's 4 of them right now. The 5th one will be coming out next summer. And I'll talk about that one in the coming days also. But this first adult novel, as I said, this kind of marinated in me for a while. I knew I wanted to do it, but I just felt driven to do the children's books first because my grandchildren were growing up and I wanted them to have this while they were that age 8 through 12. And so now my granddaughter, the oldest one, she's now 15, and my youngest grandson is 9. They still are in the books and they age with the books. Each book, they get a little bit older. But the transition was different. But you know what? I found it very easy to write this adult novel. And I have a kind of a formula I use. Like, you will hear from various authors that there's a pattern. My pattern always is I start out with a prologue, and in the the Four Cousins books, I will tell a little bit about the setting where it's going to be. And usually the setting is where they've either traveled to or we've traveled to with them. And then I always end it with an epilogue to tell what happened. Maybe, 6 months later, a couple years later. So that's the pattern I also used for Evermore. I knew I wanted the characters to be real as they were in the Four Cousins, because the Four Cousins, their dialogue is the way they talk, is the way I know them. So it's very personal. The Four Cousins and Evermore, these are people that I know, and they are my family. So they are very, very precious to me. And I get great joy out of writing. In my mind, I have another book, a sequel to Evermore, that will be coming out. And I just finished, as I said, writing the 5th book of the Four Cousins mystery series, and I'm going to start writing the sequel to Evermore because it's in my head. And being an author is like, people say to me, where do you get your ideas? I have one of the ones who wrote one of the reviews for me, Forevermore. He's a director, and he has said to me, where do you get these ideas, these stories? And I said, well, I don't know. I grew up with a house full of books. My mother loved to read. So I had all these books growing up, from the 8 Cousins to the Hardy Boys to Nancy Drew, that I absolutely loved, to Trixie Bell. Go back and think of all those books you had when you were growing up. And I loved them. And so as I grew up, I continued to read, working my way through Jane Eyre, the Brontes, and my mother and I would discuss the books. She had, like, our whole home was like a library of books. So I absolutely loved that. So I had a great imagination. That was a gift I had. And it's just that I will wake up at night when I'm writing a book and I will think, oh, I'm going to change that word, or I can put this event or this situation into the next chapter. And when I'm writing a book, when I'm writing Evermore, when I was writing this, I would literally be driving down the road, paying attention to where I'm going, but I'm living this book. And when I write my books, I become part of the book. It's just a wonderful journey. And I imagine what they're seeing, what they'll be wearing, what they're going to say. And wherever I am, I just live through the book. I just live it. I am part of it. And it is just a great experience. I can't even tell you how wonderful it is. I mean, I see the clothes they wear. If they're walking through the woods, I see the woods. I hear the sounds. And I put all of that in my book. And you're going to find out with Evermore that I go into detail about my grandmother's garden, because they loved flowers. My father loved his vegetable garden. And I go into detail on what they're wearing, because my grandmother really was a beautiful seamstress and she made all my clothes when I grew up. My mother also did all this. She worked with my grandfather. He did indeed have the Royal Rod Company and after he retired as a funeral director, and all that's in this book. So it's so personal to me. And, just I look at it and I think, I think my mom and dad, who have gone home to heaven, I think they'd be really pleased. I feel their presence when I was reading this book, writing this book. And as I read it and go through some of these, I think, I think you'd be really pleased, Mom and Dad, that I'm telling your story and the love you have, because they As I said, we're married over 65 years. So just to let you know, I hope that you'll have an opportunity to read Evermore. And if you have grandchildren, the Four Cousins Mystery Series. Again, I have a website. It's www.fourcousinsmysteries.com. And you can purchase all of my books, including Evermore, on this website. If you do purchase from me instead of Amazon or Barnes & Noble, you will receive a copy that is signed by me, and also the Four Cousins. My grandchildren will sign the book for you, and the shipping is free. So I would invite you to go ahead and check out the website. It's on Facebook. And again, you could bring it up, www.fourcousinsmysteries.com. And you'll see on there all the books. You'll see how to purchase them. And I hope, I really hope to hear from you and hope to see some of the comments that you have. And I hope you will enjoy evermore this journey through this beautiful, beautiful family of mine. And in it, see yourself, see your own family, and reflect back on how God has always walked with you. And that even though, you may not think He was there, He has always been there for you. And I am going to tomorrow, when we start out, I'm going to come back to Evermore, and I'm going to read the prologue to you, so you have an idea of how it starts out. So this is what I would really like to, start out with tomorrow, and then I will go ahead and I'll enter into the Four Cousins Mystery Series. And I will also be going into each book in detail. And if you have any questions at all about those books or about Evermore, or if you have Evermore and you've read it, be sure and just put your questions to me, because this is going to be, Evermore is going to be the topic of this Christian book club that I belong to. They can't wait to know it, because they know me and they knew my mom and dad. So they have all these questions about, is this true? Is that true? Did that really happen? So I look forward to answering all their questions. This book has stirred a great deal of interest and questions from everyone who reads it. So it's been a fun time for me. And I just hope that I will see you again tomorrow so that we can continue our journey through Evermore. And as I said, I will be reading the prologue to you. And in the coming days, I will be reading sections through each of the Four Cousins Mystery Series and talking to you a little bit about the background, the settings, and how I actually write a book. I hope to go through the steps in writing a book and in getting it published, which I find absolutely fascinating. And so I am looking forward to seeing all of you tomorrow. So have a wonderful day, and I'll see you tomorrow, 3:30 to 4, on my live stream. I hope you've enjoyed this. God bless you all.